a video for my Australian friend modifying bearing shells. Now I feel like Del Boy, with a file making a lot of noise, doing stupid shit.
G'day everybody and welcome back. It's been a minute, but I've finally got all of the bearings and everything else that I need to start reassembling this crankcase. So I sourced most of the bearings from my local SKF distributor. They had pretty well everything in stock except for one. The only bearings that I thought I'd better go through Gowan Lock and buy from them is the main crankshaft bearings. SKF had the bearings in stock. I could have purchased them through the SKF distributor. However, I thought it prudent just to be sure that we're getting the right thing. But they're basically a 40-degree angular contact bearing. Now, the ones that were supplied by Gowan Lock are not the SKF brand, but that's all right, they're fine, that's what they use, and that's perfectly suitable for the job. I did buy one other bearing from Gowan Lock that SKF didn't have in stock. So that's that. I've also got all of the seals and little gaskets and crush washers and everything else that I need for the crankcase. So today's goal is to remove the bearings from the crankcases and replace them with new, and then we need to check the shims within the gearbox and the crankshaft. So the crankshaft is preloaded, so we need to calculate what shims I need to order to be able to correctly preload the crankshaft, and I need to check whatever end float is existing on the transmission gear shafts, and if they're wrong, I'll need to reshim them. Hopefully just take shims away, because we're not using a paper gasket in the centre of the case, which is about 0.35 millimetre thick, the factory one. Aftermarket ones are different thicknesses, so whatever happens, if you split this crankcase open, you're going to need to reshim it. So this is the exercise we're going through today. Speaking of the crankshaft, I have given it a good thorough clean, and that exposed to me anyway that it was a little bit skanky in a few places. So I've given it a coat of paint, I've given it a freshen up, and I think it looks pretty bloody good. I went to a lot of trouble to mask up all of the areas that don't have paint on them and paint it properly. So how did you paint the engine? Well, I just cleaned it, and while I was washing it down with water to get rid of all the solvents, I used 320 grit wet and dry, and I went over all of the painted surfaces, and then I painted it. But what paint did you use? Frickin' engine enamel. I used a Duplicolor one. I like the Duplicolor one with ceramic. I've used it on the XS1100, and I've actually painted the ST2 barrels as well. So hopefully that doesn't surface again, and for anyone who skipped ahead, I'm not repeating it. Okay, let's pick a crankcase side and start looking at what we need to do to get the bearings out and the new bearings in. A few of you have asked about that portrait on the wall there. I've got a few of those. They're just a gimmick thing. Freaks a few people out. All right, so this is the left-hand side crankcase where the output shaft is. I'm just going to prise this seal out because we've got a new one of those, and it gives us access to the bearing from this side. We can press out this one, and this one from this side. We still have these in place. the pickups. So flip him over. And of course, this one here was our problem child. I'm hoping we can get that with an internal puller. We need to get this retainer here out, and that is there's a guy who does a bit of Ducati stuff on YouTube called Desmo Works, and I've watched a few of his videos, and he's very, very good. What I've seen on his video is that you need to preheat. I mean, I've read and heard and been told 1,000 times you need to heat this thing up in order to both extract and replace the bearings. You only need to get it up to about 100 degrees Celsius, so it's not a lot of heat, but you do need to warm the aluminium up. So we'll be doing that, but before we even get that far, we've got to get this retainer out, and you need to basically heat it up and give them a bit of a shock with a punch to make sure that you get them nice and loose before you try and undo them, because they will rip out in the aluminium apparently. So we'll take that out, we'll take the circlip out of this one here, and then we'll head over to the, we'll heat it all up, and we'll try and pull this one out, and then we will go to the press and remove the others. Now this one you can actually get a bit of access from the other side with a punch, but the risk is that you'll cock it a little bit sideways and potentially damage the casing, so I don't want to risk that. Alright, just pop this circlip out of this guy. Now I have an oxyacetylene torch here, but I think it's a bit extreme for what we're doing. Find the correct Allen key for this job here. Just see. Oh, they're pretty bloody easy. I didn't need to heat that up at all. Bit of shmoo in there. Give that a bit more of a clean when we get them out. Let's try and get this guy out. Right, there she blows. And interestingly, there's some sort of Shim washer behind it. So that'll be going back in with it. Alright, success on that one. Now let's take it to the press and knock these other guys out. Let's try that. That's that one. I'm going to try knocking these ones out by hand because they're just a bit awkward in the press. All right. Rotary hoe. So I have got all of our bearings here ready to press in. I cleaned all the smoo up. That did have some Loctite on it, but it obviously wasn't that brilliant. So we have a C3 clearance 6305 SKF bearing here, a C3 clearance 6004, I think that is. Yep, 6004. C3 clearance bearing for there. We have our small crankcase bearing. So just on that, there's two different sizes. This is for the other case. You can see that they are different sizes. And because they're an angular contact, it's imperative that you get them in the right direction, otherwise you're going to be pushing the balls away from the angled contact, not into the angled contact. So we want that to go in there, and this is our new replacement. Now the numbering convention is a little bit different from the original SKF one, only that I presume that Ducati have a ton of them on the shelf, and then they have whatever sleeve they require, if they require a sleeve, and they just grab them and couple them together. So the bearing number that you're looking for, if you are to go and order them from SKF, is an NJ203ECP. That is this bearing. And that'll go in there and have a far less play in it than the one we took out. All right, so we'll go and press these in. I'm going to use a bit of Loctite bearing retainer. If I've got some, yes I have. A bit of Loctite bearing retainer, just to help things on there stay where they should be. This is the all-important one. They're all important, but this is the one that we had an issue with. Beautiful. Nice one to go. Okay, just a couple of retainers to replace. One circlip, snap ring, whatever you call it in your country. And these guys. Now I put the red stud lock on there rather than the blue screw lock, only because I don't want them coming out. And I don't intend on ever taking this engine apart again. That might be a bit naive, but and should I have to, just requires heat. All right, new main bearing, the new idle end for the clutch input shaft bearing, the output shaft main bearing, and the cam belt timing shaft. Done. Now I could just pop that guy out of there, flipper this over, and while we're in this region, Loctite, Just fit the new seal to that. Okay. Just going to put some rubber grease behind it in the area where the seal runs and just on that spring. Okay, so that's this side of the case done. Let's not lose the whole reason we're in here. Alright, this side. Alright, again, I'll just pry this seal out. Flip him over. Retainers, circlip, blind hole, press out. Pretty well rinse and repeat.
Okay, very quickly, a couple of things that you notice yourself. It's this whole concept or business of heating up the hole properly with a blowtorch and then putting bearings in the freezer. These bearing rings, in fact the outer part of any bearing whatsoever, is not designed to flex, ever. It doesn't have to be flexible and robust because it just sits in a solid hole. Look where that is housed. That bearing ring is housed inside a thick cast aluminium machine casting. It ain't going anywhere. So it doesn't have to move, therefore its only job is to be super hard and super solid. In fact, it can afford to be brittle. It doesn't matter if it's brittle because it's not going to flex anywhere and break. You come out, you've got a red hot hole, you just heat it up with a blowtorch, you go putting that in for nothing more than laziness and convenience. You can push it in with your fingers. Yep, fine. Okay, there are other methods to put bearings in, but if you're going to do that, think about the temperature change, that sudden shock of the red hot metal against the freezing cold metal out of the fridge, one against the other. The temperature change in the outside of that steel is suddenly instantaneous. So ask yourself the question, is that liable possibly to shock that steel to either make what is already a brittle super hard steel even more hard and more brittle and fracture and break early, or on the other hand, could it even make it soft? Could it partially anneal it because you've heated the outside of it and then it's cooled down at its own time? That would be all bad because then it would wear out in a matter of months. So heating up the hole and putting in a fridge bearing, I don't do. But you do what works for you.
Alright, so I wasn't going to show all that again. So I just showed a quick bit there because I took the temperature up quite a bit higher. I took it up much closer to 100 degrees Celsius. And the bearings, of course, started to drop in until such time as the heat transferred into the bearing, and then I had to press the rest of the way. But we're all good. I'm just going to pop in the circlip now. Anyway, I've cleaned the bolts off. They were covered in Loctite. I've put some fresh Loctite on. I've also popped a bit of engine oil into this because these were shielded bearings when I bought them. I had to pop the shields out and then wash all the grease out. I left them pretty dry, so I've just popped a bit of engine oil in there just to give it some lubrication. What oil do you use? The 15W50 Motol 300V full synthetic. Put a new seal in for the timing belt drive. Lovely. Right, the only other bearings that I've got in here that have got to go in the engine are the shell bearings. And what you saw at the intro to the video was Twan just explaining to me how we get these ones to work. So these are ACL bearings. It's a brand name. They're actually for a 4AGE Toyota. There is the part number. And they just require tiniest bit of modification to make them work. Twan claims that they provide a better oil clearance than the factory ones, which can tend to be a bit tight. I'm not going to fit them yet because the old ones are perfect. I've pulled them apart and had a look. They're perfect, and I don't have any plastic gauge, and Repco wasn't open. I want to check the oil clearance on these before I go ahead and commit to them. But they are a lot cheaper. That was 70 odd Australian dollars for 8 bearing shells, so enough for a 4-cylinder car. They're about $50 per shell from DUCATI, so it's about 200 bucks for 4 from DUCATI. So if they work, they're a lot cheaper. So the next thing that we need to do is calculate the preload on the crankshaft. Okay, one crankshaft. What we need to do, these shims, we had one damaged one, but that's irrelevant really at this stage, and one good one. And this one is thicker than its mate. So we need to now measure how wide this crankshaft is. Then we have to measure the distance from the case to the bearing on both cases and work out how much total shim we need, and then we need to figure out how much shim we need on each side to centralise it. So there's a little bit of faffing about, so let's get on with it. Alright, this is just a quick do-over. I wasn't happy with the way that I'd calculated the shim requirements. Wasn't comfortable with it. The book method is to measure the length of the crankshaft between the faces where it runs in the bearings, then measure the distance from the centre of the crankcase to the bearing on each side, and that gives you a total length, and then you calculate the remainder. So if you've got, to say for argument's sake, you had 101 millimetres between the bearings and you had 100 millimetres on the crankshaft, that would give you 1 millimetre of free play, and then you add your preload to that. But there's too many variables, especially when you're dealing with a 8-inch cheap digital caliper that's got flex in it, and I just wasn't comfortable with it all. And I had all the numbers and I was going over it, and I ended up pinging a message off to Twan Vandenbigler, and I said, can you just check my math? And he said, what are you measuring? And I said, the the preload for the bearings in the crankcase. He said, I don't even do that. He said, much easier just to do what we're doing here, which is having the shaft assembled in there. There's no conrods or anything on there yet. I've just got the shaft in the bearings. There's no shims, and the crankcase has been torqued down to the 25 Newton meters on the larger bolts, and all we do then is lift it and measure the end float, which is 0.7 of a millimetre. We're aiming for somewhere around the 0.3 of a millimetre end float, preload on the bearings. So 0.7 of a millimetre of shims need to go in there to be zero preload and take out any free end float. So in order to get to somewhere around the 0.3 of a millimetre of preload on the bearings, we need to add 0.7 to take up the clearance, and then 0.3. 0.7 of a millimetre plus 0.3 of a millimetre equals 1 millimetre. The shims that came out of this motor total 0.98 of a millimetre. So that'll give us, just by using the factory shims that came with it, will give us 0.28 of a millimetre of preload. So that's without a gasket, and of course we're not using a gasket. So why is that? I don't know. Maybe it was, well, apparently Ducati were pretty good at not putting quite enough preload in. So it was probably on the light end of preloading. By that I mean between 0 preload and 0.1 of a millimetre, somewhere around there. Also, there will be wear factors, and possibly, you know, the bearings were SKF, these are not SKF. These may have been made to the other end of the tolerance to what the bearings that were in there were from. So, you know, there are variables, wear on the crankshaft, that kind of thing, that could contribute. But the good news is I have lucked out, and I don't need to order any shims, so I don't have to wait. I can put them in there. I'll have 0.28 of a millimetre of preload on my bearing, on my crankshaft bearings. We've got end float on all of the others, although I think I'll pop a shim out of the shift drum just to be safe. But essentially the cases being made of an aluminium alloy of some description has a coefficient of linear expansion very different to all the steel components within it, and it expands further, quicker than everything else for the same temperature. So as long as you have clearance on your input shaft, your output shaft, and that shift drum, it's only going to improve from there. But it would mean that you'd have to be very careful when you warm the engine up, that you warm the engine up properly before you go riding. So just to be on the safe side, I'm going to just pop the maybe a shim out of that shift drum, although it's not doing high RPMs, it's just sitting stationary for the better part of its life until you change gears. And then it's only incremental movements. It's not like the input shaft or the output shaft that are flying around. So yeah, that's where we're at. I wanted to do this because I'm happier now that I did it this way rather than the book method. In fact, when I was speaking to Tuan, he said he doesn't even measure them anymore. He just goes off feel because he does it every day. So he knows what is and what isn't right. But yeah, anyway, back to the video from last weekend. Oh, I've just thrown the transmission back in and torqued down the gearbox, torqued down the crankcase bolts. Don't panic, you'll get to see it all again when I put the thing together for the last time. It's beginning to be a long day and a long video. All right, so what we're trying to do now is, like I said, I've thrown the gearbox together. We need to determine whether or not the shims that are currently in the gearbox are suitable for what we have here, or whether or not we need to reduce those shims. Remembering that we're 0.3 of a millimetre or 0.35 of a millimetre tighter in our crankcase. So the first one, I've got the dial indicator on here and it's set to 0. We're trying to see if we've got enough end float in that shaft. So these have to have end float, the crankshaft has to have preload. And the number that we're looking for is between 0.05 of a millimetre and 0.15 of a millimetre. I should be able to just lift this guy up. And we've got about on the 0, lift up about 0.08 of a millimetre. So that's okay, that's fine. We can run with the shims that are in there. Now we need to check so that's the output shaft, we need to check the input shaft, but while we're on this side, we'll just check the shift drum. Okay, this one's now sitting on top of the shift drum. We've got about 0.05. Now you can have up to 0.5 1/4 mm deflection on that. So I just need to check, touch base with Tuan and make sure that that's okay, that it's not too little. I'll find out. So let's flip him over now and have a look at the input shaft for the gearbox. So once again, just like the other side, we're looking for between 0.05 and 0.15. So 0.05 to 0.15 millimeter on both the input shaft and the output shaft. Between 0.06 and 0.07, somewhere around that. So we should be good with those. But even more importantly, look at that. Solid as a rock. That's great. So our bearing replacement was successful. All right. I think that'll do us for now. I've got a fair bit to pack up now and it's been a long day. Never mind, we're getting there. A little bit more to go. Still waiting for the cylinder heads anyway from Gowan Lock. But it would be nice to have this in a position where it's ready to just accept the heads and put back in the frame. And we are one step closer to that. And some plasticos so I can just check the clearance, the oil clearance on between the bearings and the crankshaft, because Ducati specify this is a B crankshaft with B rods, and I think that's a red and blue shell combination. So they do have different shells for different crank and rod combinations, and that'll be a tolerance thing out of the machine shop. So they'll be at high, middle or low spec, whatever, and they'll give you the bearings to suit. But again, everything I've read and everyone who I've spoken to has told me that they run too tight a clearance, and you do need to open it up a bit, and those ACL bearings will do that job. So we'll look at that next time when hopefully we're in a position to be putting this whole thing back together again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and comment, and I will catch you next time on Andy's Motorcycle Obsessions. Bye for now.